The story of writing, astronomy, and law.
For far too long, this is what they have been telling us about Sumer.
The story of civilization itself begins in one place. Not Egypt, but Mesopotamia.
And then we have been told that the Sumerians look like this. As we will see today, just like the fallacy of a Eurasian Nubio Kemet, Sumer, as science shows, is purely a black African civilization. If there is one video on history you ever need to watch, this is it. After this, you will be equipped with everything you need to know about the true beginnings of civilization. For those who can't wait, all recent and original research on early Mesopotamia points to one source, and one source only: Black Africans. From cranial and cultural evidence to linguistic, archaeological, and genetic data, every field points to the same conclusion. It is not debatable. Because this data is rarely shared, many will deny it, especially those who are not seeking the truth. But after you see this evidence, you will wonder, why then are all depictions of the Sumerians portrayed as white? I will explain that right after I share the evidence. Just because the Sumerians were black does not mean other peoples were incapable of building civilizations. Far from it. We will see how groups who did not yet have civilizations were later drawn to and assimilated into the land of the two rivers. But for now, let's first refute that argument that you hear so often, that the Sumerian language suddenly appeared out of nowhere, and that we can't link it to prior languages. It is another one of those lies made to disconnect Sumer from Africa. What they should say is that Sumerian cannot be linked to Proto-Indo-European languages. But as for African languages, as you will see, the story is completely different. The origins of the Sumerian people, the architects of the first urban civilization in Mesopotamia, have long remained one of the most significant enigmas in ancient history. While conventional scholarship often describes the Sumerians as a linguistic isolate whose provenance is unknown, a deep synthesis of bioarchaeological, genetic, and linguistic data reveals a foundational connection to Africa. This evidence suggests that the early Sumerians were part of a wider Kushite or Africoid migration that emanated from the Nile Valley and the Green Sahara during the Holocene climatic optimum. The primary point of entry for understanding the racial identity of the Sumerians is their own self-designation. In their cuneiform records, the Sumerians referred to themselves as the Sagiga, which translates literally to the black-headed people. While some modern philologists attempt to rationalize this as a reference to black hair, the context of the ancient Near East, where diverse hair colors were not the primary phenotypic differentiator, suggests an ethnic or racial marker. Early Orientalists such as Sir Henry Rawlinson, who spearheaded the decipherment of Mesopotamian scripts, concluded that the founders of the Babylonian civilization were of Kushite origin. Rawlinson's research established that the language of the primitive Babylonians was Ethiopic, and that the Sumerian vocabulary belonged to a stock of tongues, modern specimens of which can be found in the Mara of southern Arabia and the Gala of Ethiopia. This self-identification as black-headed aligns with the descriptions provided by other ancient sources. Biblical genealogies in the book of Genesis explicitly link the early cities of Mesopotamia, Babel, Erech, Uruk, and Akkad, to Nimrod, the son of Cush, Ethiopia. The Sumerians' own mythology regarding Dilmun as the home city of the land of Sumer and a divine dwelling place likely reflects a memory of an ancestral homeland in the Arabian littoral or northeast Africa, serving as a station in their northward migration. Skeletal remains from the earliest historical strata of Mesopotamian cities provide the most direct physical evidence of the Sumerians' African ancestry. During the excavations of the 1920s at Kish and Jemdet Nasser, archaeologists uncovered a specific cranial type classified as hyperdolichocephalic, or long-headed. Researchers such as Giuseppe Sergi, Giuffrida Ruggeri, and Fleur named this the Euro-African type, noting its strong affinity to the African and Asiatic blacks of today. This appellation, Euro-African, for Euro-African, is extremely dishonest, especially for a learned anthropologist and osteologist, and here is why. Pay attention to the table below. You will notice that all the craniums retrieved from Kish, and Jemdet Nasser are either dolichocephalic or hyperdolichocephalic. Well, it so happens that dolichocephaly is a trait that is characteristic of black Africans. But as if that wasn't enough, especially in the case of Kush, these same individuals had broad nasal openings, again characteristic of black Africans. In fact, all cranium recovered were black African. That's not the only study that shows this. A study by Dr. Fari Supia came to the same conclusion. It states, the research into human remains uncovered in southern Mesopotamia was discovered using forensic analysis by craniometry. This process is CSI level proof. There are approximately 20 Kish crania in the National History Museum in London. Fari Supia, a lay physical anthropologist, measured the crania in 1977 using the 4-disc handbook. The craniometry study from ancient Kish is listed below. Well, what does it show? Egyptian male, black. Egyptian female, black. Remember, every time you see Egyptian, we are talking about the original native Egyptian stock, who they know is black African. It is yet another dishonest trick they use to try to dissociate ancient civilizations from black Africans. They try to call it Egyptian because they know the majority of the public associates Egyptian with modern Egyptians. So we see that the overwhelming majority of the craniums are black. In fact, they are more black in ratio than America is or Europe is white today. The crania examined from the Y Trench at Kish, one of the oldest Sumerian settlements, featured retreating foreheads, prominent brow ridges, and wide cheekbones. Crucially, the nasal index in many cases was described as extreme platyrrhine, broad-nosed, a feature anthropologically diagnostic of Africoid populations. Of the 14 crania Penniman examined from this trench, 8 were classified as Euro-African, while later studies by Buxton and Rice of 26 crania found 17 Euro-Africans. Despite the attempts by some contemporary researchers to minimize these findings, the physical data leaves no doubt that the early population of Lower Mesopotamia was phenotypically identical to Nilotic populations. The migration of black populations into Mesopotamia was facilitated by the climatic cycles of the Sahara. Between approximately 14,600 and 5,000 years ago, northern Africa experienced the African Humid Period, AHP, during which the Sahara was a verdant landscape of rivers, lakes, and grasslands. This green Sahara was inhabited by hunter-gatherers and pastoralists of the Unanian culture, who are considered the ancestors of the Niger-Congo and Nilo-Saharan speakers. As the Sahara began to desiccate around 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, these populations retreated to environmental refugia, such as the Nile Valley and the Gulf Oasis in the Persian Gulf. The desiccation of the Sahara acted as a pump, pushing advanced agricultural and pastoral groups into Western Asia. This transition explains the sudden appearance of the Ubaid culture in Mesopotamia, which introduced advanced irrigation, weaving, and metallurgy, technologies that have been traced back to the Saharan highlands and the Nile Valley. And is there any other evidence that linked the early civilization of the Levant to black African populations? Yes, plenty. And it's evidence of the highest quality. The genetic foundation of the Sumerian population can be traced to the Natufian culture of the Levant, which served as the Neolithic bridge between Africa and Mesopotamia. Genome-wide studies of Natufian remains have revealed a substantial genetic component derived from ancient North Africans, ANA. This ANA lineage, which constitutes approximately 36.5% to 50% of Natufian ancestry, represents a deeply diverged African population that is ancestral to modern sub-Saharan Africans and the first farmers of the Near East. The presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E, particularly EM78 and EM123, among early Levantine and Mesopotamian populations, further confirms a male line descent from African ancestors. Haplogroup E is recognized as a primary African marker, and its dominance in the early Neolithic Near East indicates that the spread of farming was driven by African-descended groups. Furthermore, mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, haplogroup M1, which is characteristic of Ethiopian and Egyptian populations, has been found in ancient Mesopotamian and Indian samples, supporting a continuous Kushite genetic belt from the Nile to the Indus. And when you hear Ethiopian and Egyptian designations in research papers, what they are really referring to are the native ancient populations of those regions who we know are pure black people, as was attested by both first-hand accounts like the Greeks and genetics.
We were the mothers of the Sumerian civilization. There is not a single word in Sumerian but has an exact equivalent in Africa.
The linguistic evidence for the African origin of the Sumerians is found in the deep structural and lexical parallels between Sumerian and the Niger-Congo/Bantu superfamily. Dr. Clyde Winters argues that Sumerian is an integral part of the Bafsudralam language family, which includes Niger-Congo, Dravidian, and Elamite. Like Bantu languages, Sumerian is agglutinative, meaning that complex words are formed by stringing together invariable roots and particles. This grammatical structure is a fundamental departure from the inflected systems of the later Semitic and Indo-European languages in the region. Comparative studies have identified numerous cognates between Sumerian and Mande, a branch of Niger-Congo, and Bantu. For example, the Sumerian word for head, pa, is mirrored in various African tongues, and the term for father, pa or pab, finds direct parallels in the Nilotic and Bantu spheres. Computational data mining of Swadesh lists has demonstrated a significant degree of interrelatedness between Bantu and the Euphratic language, Proto-Sumerian, suggesting they descended from a common proto-language spoken in the Saharan highlands before 10,000 BCE. My conversation with Brother Kamjaverse further strengthened the linguistic argument of the connection between ancient African languages and the various languages spoken throughout the continent today. It is important because if we can link the Sumerian language to the greater ancient African language spoken from ancient Sahara to the Levant, then we can show linguistic genetic continuity that followed the ethnic continuity of these populations from then to today's Black Africa. Metromenkemi, often reconstructed by these scholars as MDWNKM.T or Metu Nkemi, meaning speech of the land of the blacks, serves as the linguistic anchor for this school of thought. In 1885, the Haitian scholar Antenor Firmin published De l'égalité des races humaines, the equality of the human races. He was one of the first to challenge the then emerging Hamitic hypothesis by insisting that the ancient Egyptians were racially and culturally African. Antenor Firmin stated that the Egypt of the pharaohs was essentially a Negro nation. To separate its history from that of the rest of the black race is to commit a scientific error as much as a historical one. Egypt is to Black Africa what Greece and Rome are to the Western world. Sheikh Anta Diop transitioned the argument from general anthropology to rigorous linguistics. He acknowledged the French linguist Lilius Hamburger, who posited an Egyptian influence on African languages in the 1940s, but went further, arguing for a genetic relationship, meaning they share a common ancestor, which he termed Paléo-Africain. And he stated, the history of Black Africa will remain suspended in the air and cannot be written correctly until African historians dare to connect it with the history of Egypt. For us, the Egyptian language was not a relative, but the very source of the languages of the continent. Building on Diop's work, Théophile Obenga applied the comparative method of historical linguistics to demonstrate that ancient Egyptian, Metromenkemi, and modern African languages, such as Wolof, Mbochi, and Bantu languages, belong to a single family he named Negro-Egyptian, Niger Egyptian. The Niger Egyptian family constitutes a genetic unit. Ancient Egyptian is to the African languages what Latin is to the Romance languages, or Sanskrit to the Indo-European languages. It is the classical reference point for our linguistic history. As we noted, a significant number of scholars from the Bantu regions and West Africa have since added massive amounts of data to this model. They have moved from general comparisons to detailed reconstructions of specific subfamilies. Ndigi and Pascal Pega have provided extensive data on the Bassa language, Cameroon, and its Egyptian cognates. Hilaire Esso Ngome has linked the Bakosi language to the Metromenkemi model. Mumuni Farmo has worked on the Songhay Egyptian connection. Nkuka Luka has analyzed the relationship between Congo and Egyptian. Dieudonné Toukam, a prominent voice in this group, summarizes the current state of the research. The genetic relationship between ancient Egyptian and the languages of the African continent is no longer a mere hypothesis. It is a linguistic fact, supported by thousands of lexical, morphological, and phonetic correspondences that follow strict laws of evolution. The material culture and iconography of the early Sumerians further established their Black identity and Nilotic roots. The system of writing used in Sumer shares a closest affinity with that of Egypt, with many alphabetic signs being identical. Both civilizations used cylinder seals for administration, and the practice of sealing jars with clay, precisely as in early Egypt, was standard in Sumer. Sumerian laws, medical knowledge, and astronomical systems have also been cited as products of Black migrations from the Nile Valley. In art, the representations of Sumerian kings and deities often feature Africoid characteristics. The famous statues of Gudea, Patesi of Lagash, were meticulously carved from black diorite, a choice of stone that many argue was intended to reflect the physical complexion of the ruler. These statues display full lips, broad faces, and sturdy frames consistent with the Euro-African craniometric data. Furthermore, the standard of depicts Sumerian soldiers and elites with distinct features that contrast with their lighter-skinned, tattooed enemies, further emphasizing the ethnic distinction of the black-headed people. The Sumerians did not exist in isolation, but were part of a broader network of Black-led civilizations in Asia. Their eastern neighbors, the Elamites of Susa, are frequently cited as a Black population, with artistic remains showing clear Africoid traits and hairstyles. The Elamite language is also linked to the Dravidian and Niger-Congo families, forming part of the Kushite belt that spanned from the Atlantic to the Indus Valley. This global Kushite presence extended into India, where the Indus Valley, Harappan, civilization was founded by Black peoples, whose skeletal remains and mother goddess cults mirror those of the Nile and Sumer. The description of the Shang dynasty in China as black and oily of skin, and the African origins of the first Japanese shogun further suggest that the Sumerians were the Mesopotamian vanguard of a massive African expansion that shaped the foundations of human civilization across the ancient world. I did promise at the beginning of the video that I would explain why all the image of ancient Sumer that you see are of white or Semitic-looking peoples. Well, virtually all of them are from the Gutian rule of Lagash. They were essentially foreigners from Central Asia that invaded the civilization for a brief period. The Gutians, also Gutians, Guti, Kuti, Kurti, 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 and Kurdu, were a tribe from northern and central ranges of Zagros Mountains that overran southern Mesopotamia when the Akkadian Empire collapsed in approximately 2154 BC. The Gutian dynasty came to power in Mesopotamia around 2150 BC by destabilizing Akkad, according to the Sumerian king list at the end of the reign of King Ur-Utu, or Lugal-Malem, of Uruk. They reigned for perhaps around 1 century. Copies of the king list vary between 25 and 124 years. 91 years is often quoted as probable. The dynasty was succeeded by the third dynasty of Ur. Next to nothing is known about their origins, as no Gutian artifacts have surfaced from that time. Little information is gleaned from the contemporary sources. Nothing is known of their language either, apart from those Sumerian king names, and that it was distinct from other known languages of the region, such as Sumerian, Akkadian, Hurrian, Hittite, and Elamite. Archaeologists have been unable to identify a single fragment of material culture in Mesopotamia as belonging to the Guti, and the Akkadian, Western Semitic, texts contain no loanwords identifiable as Indo-European. Except for their name and their activities as recorded in the Mesopotamian texts, the Guti are all but invisible. Sumerian sources portray the Gutians as a barbarous, ravenous people from Gutium or Kutium, Sumerian, Gutuum or Gutium, in the mountains, presumably the central Zagros east of Babylon and north of Elam. The Sumerian king list represents them as ruling over Sumer for a short time after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, and paints a picture of chaos within the Gutian administration. And it is from that period that the majority of the Sumerian artifacts that we see come from. Just like they did in Egypt, where artifacts from the Roman period of Kemet are portrayed as the face of the civilization, so too is Sumer overrepresented by this short-lived invader rule. But the artifacts and the abundance of evidence that clearly show them as black as we have seen are seldom shared. And the whole region would remain black until the total invasion by the Persians in 500 BC. This is also why the Phoenician artifacts that predate that invasion are also black, as we have seen in previous episodes. The real shame is that 19th century archaeologists and Assyriologists were already aware of these facts. They were privy to cranial remains and texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which makes multiple clear references to the protagonists being of Black African ethnicity. Furthermore, they already knew the Sumerians' own self-appellation, a name well known to those who study history. They called themselves the Black-Headed People, or Salmat Kakadi. This aligns perfectly with how the ancient Egyptians referred to themselves and their land, Kemet and Kemetiu, meaning the land of the black people. It is a disgrace that the very figures we rely on to tell the truth about our past, those who treat the scientific method almost as gospel, have hidden revelations that could have liberated an entire continent. Their failure added the final stroke of a division that sought to paint a picture of humanity that excluded black men and women. This lie was used as a justification to dehumanize the very people to whom we owe everything. We owe them the spark of humanity itself, the first civilizations of the ancient Sahara, the Nubio-Kemetic civilizations, the massive ancient societies in southern Africa that remain unstudied, and Mesopotamia itself. But now that we know the truth, and the goddess Hathor has rebuilt our temple of self stone by stone, we will reclaim the halls of the god Anu and grant him his proper title, Anunnaki, Anu the Black. As always, huge thank you to the researchers in the community past and current that contribute to my work. From Trill Black, The Debunker, Manu Ampim, Chancellor Williams, George G.M. James, Mr. Imhotep, Robin Walker. Special thanks to Cam Jivers on this one, whose research into linguistics showed that there is an ancient unifying Afro language that covered the entirety of the continent and from which almost all modern African languages derive. If you download a lot of social media clips, try out our new tool, withouthustle.net. Easiest way to download short clips. Join us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.